Buxton. My husband, Julian, and I have the privilege of having this bookstore in our hometown, Charleston, and tonight is a special privilege because we have our friend and colleague, Damon Fordham. Damon has been working with us for 6 years now, giving the Lost Stories of Black Charleston tour. So he started with us. Some of you know us from over on the corner of Concord and Cumberland before we moved to 160 King Street. And Damon has an educator's heart. He has his undergraduate degree in business management from USC, his master's of U.S. history from the College of Charleston. He is a professor of history at the Citadel and Charleston Southern University. He is the author of several books, all of which are for sale here. True Stories of Black Charleston, Voices of Black Charleston.
South Carolina.
Yes, Mr. Potts and Me, I'm reading it, it's incorrect. Incorrect titles. And the 1895 Segregation Fight in South Carolina, which he is going to talk with us about tonight. But most of all, Damon is just an extraordinary human. You really are. You make every day a little bit better when we get to work with you. He says that there is no such thing as a stupid question. I disagree with that. There seem to be a lot of stupid questions that get asked around here. And Damon's approach to it is always one that it is an opportunity to educate. You can't know something until you know it. And he has taught me to take a breath and to be able to have conversations in this bookstore and elsewhere that I would have had a difficult time having, because I would have wanted to stop someone or to change their mind too quickly or to tell them why they were wrong. And Damon has taught me to take a breath and to ask a question and then to listen and let them. Damon says this in funnier ways, but he's basically like, let them talk sometimes. And he's never short supply of words of wisdom. And oh, hello, another wise man. And anyway, it is such a privilege to get to work with him. It is a privilege to get to be his bookseller. And I'm going to turn it over to him because he is going to talk about things much better than I. But thank you, Damon, for the privilege of working together and for continuing to write books and tell stories and better our world.
You're welcome. Thank you. So, basically, I'm going to talk tonight about two of these books in particular. One is called Voices of Black South Carolina, and the other is my most recent one, the 1895 Segregation Fight in South Carolina, because while they can both be read independently of each other, they both are kind of bookends to a very important and neglected period in our American history. And that is the Reconstruction era. And in 1896, after the last major event that I'm going to talk about wound down, Jorge Santayana, a philosopher at Harvard University, in 1896, he said, "Those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And by the time I'm through talking about this, you will understand why I use that particular phrase. So, the Reconstruction era, from 1865 to 1877, was a period that was largely censored in our history books. And as a result of that, and for reasons that I'm going to get into very shortly, it's the period where the North tried to reform the South after the Civil War through three constitutional amendments. 13th Amendment in 1865 ending slavery throughout the country, 14th Amendment in 1868 saying that all persons born here were citizens, and the 15th Amendment in 1870 saying that all males who were born here had the right to vote. But there's some very important background to a lot of this stuff. Number one, you have to understand, you cannot talk about the cure about a problem until you know the cause. And the cause goes back considerably further than this. Those of you who are familiar with history know about Senator James Henry Hammond, who had what was called the mudsill theory. And the mudsill theory is the foundation of a lot of these problems. You see, with the rise of enslavement and so forth going on here and the plantation system, they kind of understood early that there was a deep fear that the poor whites, in their poverty and illiteracy and squalor, would find common cause with their enslaved black brothers, and that the two of them would come together and overthrow the plantation owners of the South to create a social, political, economic, and cultural revolution. So needless to say, one of the main things about this system was to try to prevent this kind of stuff from happening. And thus is the fruit of our problem here. So anyway, after the fall of the Confederacy and the end of slavery, you had this situation where they had the black codes throughout South Carolina as well as the rest of the South, where they're passing laws to basically re-enslave people. Because in 1865, right as the Civil War was ending, down in Savannah, Georgia, on Macon Street, General William Tecumseh Sherman, along with General Oliver Howard, met with a black minister named Reverend Garrison Frazier over on Macon Street. And he asked them, what do the Negroes want? And so he said, the Negroes and the ex-slaves want land. So they came up with this idea called Sherman's Field Order Number 15, which said that from Charleston to Jacksonville, the Sea Island areas would be partitioned off to the former black Union soldiers and their families, where they would get the equivalent of 40 acres and a mule. Okay? Lincoln was all for this. But, Houston, we have a problem. After the war, Lincoln and his wife Mary Todd decided to celebrate and go to the theater one night. And Lincoln never made it back. Why? Because April 11, 1865, Lincoln made his last speech. It was 2 days after they surrendered, the Confederates surrendered Appomattox. And he said that among other things, in the language of the time, he said that based on their performance in the war, he saw no reason why the, quote, colored man should not get the franchise. And he also supported the idea of black people going to public schools. Now, this was a turnaround from his earlier statements, in part due to the valor of black soldiers in the Civil War and his consultation with Frederick Douglass, in sort of the same way that Martin Luther King would serve in that same fashion with John F. Kennedy exactly a century later. Funny how history works, doesn't it? So anyway, John Wilkes Booth was in the audience, and he said that dog wasn't going to hunt. And so at the Ford's Theater, April 14th, 1865, Lincoln is assassinated. But guess what? Yeah, we have another problem, because to balance the ticket, Lincoln had this guy from Tennessee to serve as his vice president, Andrew Johnson, a man with very much the attitudes of his region. And he was not about to take the ex-Confederates' land and give it to newly freed black people. And that led to land battles in places like Edisto and St. Catherine's Island down in Georgia. And for the interest of time, I'll just mention one name that is interesting in that part of the story, a fellow by the name of the Reverend Tunis Campbell, who led efforts for black people down in Georgia to keep the land that they got from the 40 acres and a mule, which unfortunately was not successful. So anyway, to make a long story short, the Northerners in Congress, led by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, said, Andrew, you got to cut this mess out. You're bringing slavery back. We didn't even need to fight a war if we're going to do this sort of stuff. So Andrew Johnson was impeached, and he didn't run again in 1868, and these constitutional amendments were passed. So here in Charleston, a revolution took place on the corner of Meeting and Broad from January to April of 1868. 76 blacks and 48 whites gathered. in what was then known as the Charleston Clubhouse, but what we now know as the Julius Waitie's Waring Judicial Center. And they passed this revolutionary constitution for South Carolina, which, among other things, called for the removal of pro-discrimination laws from the books. Women would get the right to divorce abusive husbands. And as a matter of fact, William J. Whipper, who was one of the first black lawyers over on Broad Street, he actually proposed that women get the right to vote. Well, that was a little too radical for them. But he had a wife named Frances Rollin, who was one of the first black female authors in South Carolina, I might add, who was also very progressive. And they also called for the end of debtors' prisons and the buildings of state hospitals and mental institutions. But Robert Smalls, best known as the man who freed his family by sneaking them aboard the Confederate ship, the Planter, and that's him, of course, on the cover of the book Voices of Black South Carolina that tells the story. Robert Smalls got up on January the 23rd, 1868, and declared, "Resolved, all children between the ages of 7 and 14 must attend public school at least 6 months a year under penalty of noncompliance." That, ladies and gentlemen, was the first public school law ever passed this far south of the Mason-Dixon line. And that led to something even way more radical than that. My alma mater, University of South Carolina, from 1873 to 1877, it was the first and only desegregated school anywhere in the Deep South during the 1800s. Henry Hayne, who I believe was from Marlborough County, if I recall correctly, was the first African-American student there. And a few of the professors and a number of students resigned. But within a few years, they kind of got used to it. There was a Thomas McCants Stewart who wrote in 1874 about how blacks and whites were getting along rather swimmingly as students over there. The changes were coming, people were slowly getting used to it, okay? But however, in that 1868 Constitutional Convention, Reverend Francis Cardozo, who was the founding principal of the Avery Institute, he said we have to make this new legislation so locked tight that no future leaders can undo it. That was prophecy. Because you see, needless to say, this was not without resistance. In Pulaski, Tennessee, December 24th, 1865, 6 Confederate veterans gathered to form the Resistance Army against Reconstruction and all these kind of changes. They named themselves after the Greek word for circle, which is kuklos, and the Scottish word for family, which is clan. Y'all see where this went? Hello. So, this led almost to Civil War II at a theater near you. The Klan spread throughout the Deep South like crabgrass. Almost the entire white male population of York County, as well as my home county of Spartanburg and all of that, there was just massive uproar all through the South as a result of this. But it was not without resistance. In 1871, one of the black lawyers on Broad Street, Robert Brown Elliott, was among those who testified against the brutality of the Ku Klux Klan. And another person, a couple of people who were very instrumental in that, were 2 leaders that space and time will not give me a whole lot of time to talk about tonight, but I would think you'd really want to read about these people. I mentioned Reverend Tunis Campbell down in Georgia earlier. There was also Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, who was preaching about back to Africa and self-reliance and nationalism long before Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X were born. In fact, in 1878, the same Bishop Henry McNeil Turner led a group of Charlestonians on a ship called the Azor out in Charleston Harbor back to Liberia, as this stuff was getting thick. Then in Wilmington, North Carolina, you had Abraham Galloway, who was a Union veteran who led an armed black posse to fight off the Ku Klux Klan in Wilmington in 1868. And had he been alive 30 years later in 1898, I doubt if that massacre would have probably occurred. He died in 1870 of natural causes. So one of the things about this is that, contrary to popular belief, it was not a case where the African Americans just went to church and prayed while all this stuff was happening. A lot of these folks were shooting back and taking names as a result of all of this. As a matter of fact, in one of the best known cases of this was the Hamburg Massacre in 1876, where there was an African American who was riding his coat, but was drilling a group of soldiers named Prince Rivers. And Matthew C. Butler, a former Confederate colonel, was trying to ride his buggy through, and he demanded they disperse. And Prince Rivers like, "Who are you? We're doing our drills." And so Matthew C. Butler is, how dare he be so impotent as to not let us white men go through. So Prince Rivers said, all right, you go on through. Well, Matt called up to some reinforcements, and including a gentleman out of Trenton, South Carolina, Edgefield County, who plays a major role in our story, Benjamin Ryan Tillman, a fellow who lost an eye to illness some years earlier. Well, they got together and shot up the black community and chased about a large number of them out of Hamburg. But not too long after this, a gathering of thousands of African Americans marched over to Market Street in downtown Charleston, South Market, where the market is right now. And as these thousands of people marched, there was a case where police were about to arrest the black boy, and the black crowd demanded, "This ain't Hamburg! This ain't Hamburg! This ain't Hamburg!" And they let the boy go. And this minister got up and said, "Listen, you got to remember that we're not going to be patient forever. You have to remember that there are many of us in this state who have never known slavery and will not hesitate to use the shotgun or other such measures." You might have heard of him. His name was Bishop Richard Harvey King, the founding minister of Mother Emanuel AME Church. Now, all the stuff I'm telling you right now is from the newspapers of that time, like the Charleston News and Courier and so forth, from that period through primary sources. And then in Cane Hoy is where things really got wild, when a group of white men threatened to shoot up a black political rally. A number of the African Americans already had guns and sort of beat them to it, in what's called the Cane Hoy Massacre. So it was kind of bloody on both sides. November the 8th, 1876, blacks and whites shot it out in the middle of Broad Street. Okay? And if you haven't heard about any of this, don't be surprised. So the federal government said, yo, this is too much. We've had enough of this mess. So this led to the Tilden-Hayes Compromise of 1877, which, to make a long story short, the states were having incomplete results in the 1876 presidential election, including missing ballots from South Carolina, Louisiana, and guess what, folks? Florida! Yeah. More things changed, the more they stayed the same. And so that led to the Compromise of 1877. February 26, 1877, the electors decided that, okay, we'll give the election to Rutherford B. Hayes if the North agrees to stop interfering with the South and to rescind the federal troops and let the South handle its own business. And the North said, deal, because they were just sick and tired of all the bloodshed and goings on. And so that was the end of Reconstruction. And so Wade Hampton was the governor of South Carolina. And the first African-American professor at the University of South Carolina was Richard Theodore Green, who now has a statue of him next to our library, right? Well, after the Tilden-Hayes Compromise, he and all the other black students and the black teachers, they had to go and did not come back until 1963. Okay? And so things made a huge step backwards. It got so crazy that in 1892, okay, Charleston News and Courier printed this little tidbit here. August 29th, 1892. A separate list of Negro voters must be kept and returned with the poll list. Every Negro attempting to vote must produce a written statement by a white man who shall swear that they know of their own knowledge that such votes voted for Governor Wade Hampton in 1876 and have voted the Democratic ticket continuously ever since. This statement must be placed in the ballot box by the managers. Draw your own conclusions, folks. And not too long before that, on November the 12th, 1879, there was a group of black voters in Mount Pleasant, in the 4 Mile section of Mount Pleasant, around Olive Branch AME Church. And there was a contested election where the defeated opponent, who was a Democrat, now in those days the Democrats were the arch conservatives and the Republicans were the liberals, quote unquote, that he was enticing illiterate black men to vote. Well, so they took them down to the courthouse over on Broad Street, and they interrogated them and basically made mock of their illiteracy, asking them who was Lincoln, who was Columbus, who was George Washington, and so forth. And they went to one guy where they asked him about all this, and he just repeated over and over, "I can read." And it was like, "You can?" And he just kept going over, "I can read, I can read." And so the judges finally just had to dismiss him because it's like, oh, it's obvious. Well, this gentleman, as it turned out, was an 1873 graduate of the Avery Institute. His classmate was the Reverend John L. Dart, for whom our Black Library is named after. And I grew up hearing this story for years until a cousin of mine actually produced the transcript of this. This was my great-grandfather, James Buchanan Maxwell. So I put that in the book also. Well, so as you see, this is beginning to be a slow erasure because the 15th Amendment in 1870 said that you couldn't just flat out deny them the right to vote because they're black. So they had to use all this chicanery. Well, Mississippi, then they had what was called the Mississippi Plan, 1890. James K. Vardaman, the white chief, governor of Mississippi, held a special session of the Mississippi legislature to where they would use what's called literacy tests and things like that to have the registrar decide who could vote and who couldn't. And so that meant that somebody could come up there and who was white and sign their name with an X and vote, whereas somebody who was, say, black and graduated from Alcorn or Jackson State University could say, "Excuse me, but I desire the right to use the franchise." All right, boy, let me ask you this. How many bubbles in a bar of soap? 1,337 bubbles in a bar of soap. All right, can you tell me the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States and the preamble? The preamble is, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility." All right. And then the story goes, they would hold up something in Chinese and say, "Can you read this?" And he'd say, "It means you don't want me to vote." Bingo! Bye! And that's how it would go until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So South Carolina was watching this. And by this time, Benjamin Ryan Tillman became our senator. Well, he was governor first. And while he was governor, he sent a black man named John Peterson up in Denmark, South Carolina, to the hands of a lynch mob. Okay? And during the 1893 hurricane, denied funds for blacks who were trying to get financial relief and compensation from all of this, right? He made it clear on whose side he stood. His big thing was this. He saw that as long as blacks were voting, the white vote would also be divided between these people who were called the conservatives and his followers, okay? And he was trying to basically get all the whites to leave the conservatives. Now, conservatives, they were okay with black people voting as long as black people voted their way. But the straight-outs, or otherwise the Tillmanites as they were well known as, sound familiar? They were just outright saying, we don't want black people voting at all. So Tillman seized upon all of this to eradicate black voting and create South Carolina a one-party state so that people like him could stay in power. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So in 1895, he decided to have a constitutional convention where they would make segregation the law of the state, and this would build him his power base among the poor whites. Well, however, black people were not taking this lying down. In the middle of 1895, they had this convention where they decided to send 6 men to go to the State House in South Carolina when they were going to debate this between September and December of 1895. And they wound up with 6 of them. The great Robert Smalls, William J. Whipper, James Wigg and Isaiah Reed, 2 black lawyers from Beaufort, South Carolina. Thomas Miller, soon to be the founding president of South Carolina State. And Robert Anderson, a black teacher from Georgetown. And they selected well. During one of the first sessions of the convention, Tillman and his men advocated a law that would ban interracial marriages, quote unquote. So Robert Smalls, this is in October of 1895, got up and said, well, you know, that's not a bad idea. However, I'd like to add an amendment to that. And they said, what's that? He said, not only should they ban white men from marrying black women and black men marrying black women, we should also pass a law saying that no white man can hold a black woman as a concubine. Their response was the same as yours just now in that State House in Columbia. They're like, uh-oh, they got good and quiet on that one. Because as you know, most of these people usually had black concubines in spite of their rhetoric in those days. By the way, Tillman's lawyer and campaign manager was a fellow by the name of Will Thurman. And I think all of us in this room were alive when his son was our senior senator. That's Strong's daddy. That's how close we are to all this stuff. And we all know, well, Strong's daughter, his African-American daughter, Essie Mae Washington, was my father's classmate at South Carolina State. And the one time we met, we had a pretty good conversation about that. So, this showed them what they were dealing with. These folks were no pushover. So, in the midst of all this, Thomas Miller got up and made this great speech. And here's a little bit of background before that. I was inspired to write about this because some years ago, back in the 90s, I was reading a book called Lift Every Voice by Philip S. Foner, which was a compilation of black speeches from 1797 to 1901. And I read where Thomas Miller got up during the same occasion and made this address. Call us aliens, we aliens, the people who are the foundation of the American civilization, aliens, a people who by their sweat existed in clothing the barren wrecks of the Northeast and Verdun, who drained the swamps of the South and made them to mimic gold in harvest time, who by our endurance, toil, and suffering made it possible for our white neighbors to establish this government, the asylum of us all, who by our toil established the canal and railroad systems of this country. If you call us aliens, then to whom can the term citizens be applied? And that's just a small part of it, too. And Tillman and Miller's speech was so powerful that there was a part 2 of that speech, by the way. And the various newspapers at the time reported that the galleries of the State House were jam-packed with people from all over the country. There were telegraph services and newspaper people from around the country telegraphing what was going on. That these black men were making this brave show at the State House. Robert Smalls, his perhaps most famous statement was made during this period, November the 1st. He said, this should not have been brought here. and my race has honored me with a seat on this floor, and I shall serve them to my best of my ability. My race needs no special defense, for this past history of them in this country proves them to be equal of any people anywhere. All they want is an equal chance of the battle of life. I am proud of them, and by their acts toward me, I know that they are not ashamed of me, for they have at all times honored me with their votes and loyalty. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to think about the level of this kind of oratory and what you hear nowadays that passes as political oratory. Makes you think, doesn't it? So like I said, newspaper people from around the world were just amazed at the spectacle. And Tillman was getting kind of flustered with all this too. And then William J. Whipper, who is a great-grandnephew of Seth Whipper, who was a recently retired magistrate, he laid some double-barrel ammunition on this too by saying this in his address. This convention is about to make a great mistake in not giving the Negro latitude. The car of Negro progress is coming, and instead of allowing it to come on, you wish to stop it. You may just as well make up your minds that the Negro will rise. We will not be crushed. The Negro will rise, sooner or later. Crush us as you may. The Negro, with our perseverance, our pluck, will and must come out. We will not be kept down forever. It is not the nature of human affairs. This was going so much so that Booker T. Washington, a man who is often given short shrift in history for compromising and so forth, there was another side of this guy if you actually read his writings. And this is what, and he wrote an open letter to Benjamin Tillman about this. He goes on to say that, Dear Senator Tillman, I am no politician. I have never made a political speech and do not know if I will ever make one. But I was born a slave and you were free. I am a humble member of a race. While you are a member of the greatest legislative body on earth and of the Caucasian race. The difference between us is great, yet I do not believe you will scorn the appeal I make of you on behalf of the 65,000 of my race in your state who are now suppliants at your feet and whose destiny you hold in your hands. And he goes on to say that, I cannot believe that in the eve of the 20th century, where there is more enlightenment, more progress, more self-sacrifice, more love for humanity than ever existed in any stage of the world history, but that you would want to shut off the light to our people and keep us in darkness. But he goes on to say that, you honored senator, are a student of history. Has there ever been a race that has been helped by ignorance? Has there ever been a race that was harmed by intelligence? You are saying that the Negro school should practically be closed because we cannot bear our proportion in burdens of taxation. Can an ignorant man produce taxable property faster than the intelligent man? Will capital and immigration be attracted to a state in which 3 out of 4 are ignorant and where poverty and crime abound? And he goes on to say that whatsoever, Senator Tillman, whatsoever a man soweth, that also shall he reap. So what happened to the condition of South Carolina after this? Prophecy, y'all. Pure prophecy. Well, anyway, the final vote came to all of this. And believe it or not, the reaction was such to these speeches. The eyes of the world are upon them. That 2 of the white delegates, T.E. Dudley out of Marlborough, South Carolina, and John Harleston Reed out of Georgetown, voted along with the black men as the only ones who voted against the Segregation Constitution of 1895. And at the end of all of this, Robert Smalls and the other black delegates, they not only refused to sign the new Jim Crow Constitution, Robert Smalls said that before he would sign anything like that, he would rather walk home to Beaufort than put his name on that rag. Real acts of profiles of courage here, folks. And there's some interesting endings to this, but I think I'll save that for whenever you decide to purchase and read this, because the way that this ends comes to show you that while these men may have lost that battle, in the long run of history, they won the war. And what we have to do today is to pay attention to what's happening currently and see to it that they were the actual victors in this battle. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
So, now that you've gotten the basic idea of all that, I'll be happy to take some questions, and then I'll be happy to sign the books for you.
And it's telling the story about the...
Oh, wait, excuse me, wait. One more thing I have to say before I finish this up is that in 1945, there was a black folklorist named J. Mason Brewer who was collecting black folklore up in Orangeburg. And yeah, I see it. So J. Mason Brewer, who was collecting folklore up in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And he came across an elderly black man named Murray Holiday. And one of the tales that he told him, and I'm working on an anthology of black folklore as we speak, was the following one about the 1895 convention. And he said that Tillman was up there talking a bunch of nonsense, and that one of the black delegates was getting the best of Tillman. Until finally Tillman got exasperated and said, "You black rascal, I'm going to swallow you alive." And the black legislator replied, "If you do, you'll have more brains in your belly than you do in your head."
I love it.
That's also in this book, too. Now, I'll take your question.
My wife, sweet wife, was prompting me to remember a story. Damon. I was a graduate student at the University of Virginia, and I studied with Willie Lee Rose, who wrote Rehearsal for Reconstruction.
Right.
Wonderful woman. Very interesting. My first introduction to the South, because I was an Ohio boy.
Mm-hmm.
But we had problems. And some of this, I'd been in the Army. I was on VA assistance studying for the PhD. And I rented a farmhouse out in Louisa County for $40 a month because it was too expensive to stay in Charlottesville.
Mm-hmm.
And that election fall, 1968, the sheriff in Louisa County, who was a Byrd Democrat, conservative of course, arrested 13 people for trying to register Republicans on the courthouse green. He said, I wasn't going to have any of that in my county. And that was sort of my introduction to Southern massive resistance. And of course, at that time, the schools were all closed in Virginia.
This is 1958 or 68?
68. 67, 68.
That's before the Republicans
Flipped, of course.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah.
But it was quite an introduction.
And where are you originally from?
South Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
Although I grew up in San Francisco.
Rutherford B. Hayes' home state.
Yeah.
Interesting.
The mother of presidents.
There you go.
All bad.
Yes, Nelson.
One thing I wonder if you could give us a little bit of context with what was going on at the end of Reconstruction in South Carolina. What can you tell us about the other deep Southern states? I mean,
Well,
because I'm always having a hard time believing that Whipper and all the others were the only ones.
No, they were not, because I just mentioned earlier Abraham Galloway up in North Carolina, as well as Bishop Henry McNeil Turner and Tennessee Campbell in Georgia. You also had people like Hiram Revels in Mississippi, and there were numerous others as well as in Alabama and Florida and Tennessee and the rest of those states. And of course, being a South Carolinian, naturally, I paid more attention to that. But the histories of how Reconstruction played out in these other states are amazing stories that deserve to be written also, because it kind of played out in similar ways in the other deep Southern states. Oh, I have to add this. The school books in South Carolina from 1917 to 1984, the year after I graduated from high school, there's the History of South Carolina, written by Mary Sims Oliphant. Okay, now in around that same time, 1917, the Daughters of the Confederacy, led by Mildred Rutherford down in Georgia, prohibited the teaching of the idea that slavery had anything to do with the formation of the Confederacy, in spite of the Articles of Secession, of course, right? But and so things like this were censored from the history books. So in the South Carolina history book by Mary Sims Oliphant, from 1917 to the 1980s, this is what it had to say about that 1895 Constitution. Constitution of 1895. The legislature in the session of 1894 called for an election of delegates to form a constitutional convention. This election was held, and the convention met in Columbia in September of 1895. There were some reforms tended and rendered in many directions, but the first object of the convention was to redraft the election laws so as to give the white people protection against an overbearing but illiterate Negro majority. Okay. The convention opened, committees were appointed, and a constitution framed. The last constitution, the one of 1868, had been the work chiefly of aliens and Negroes without character. The constitution framed in 1895 is the one under which we live today. That was in the school books of South Carolina from 1917 to 1984. And most people know what they are told, pure and simple. So this is why attention has to be paid to elements of this type of thing happening today. Because, see, not everybody's going to do like people like myself and Mr. Frazier here and Dr. Powers and people like that and go through these old newspapers and primary sources to dig this stuff up for the people, you see. So that's why I have this ongoing conversation with Mr. Joe McGill, who does the Slave Dwellings Project, where he goes over to places that were once slave quarters and he sleeps in them to bring attention to this part of our history. I often tell him that just as the people in Ukraine are now using guerrilla warfare against the former Soviet Union, since they can't use conventional warfare, those of us who know this stuff have to engage in guerrilla teaching. That is, if they take this stuff out of schools, well, which many of them aren't even teaching this stuff in the first place, you know, we who know this stuff have to take this stuff out to the general public so that they can know and understand and build on the success of all of this and avoid the mistakes being made all over again.
I was going to give a shout out to Herb Frazier and to Joe McGill's book that is coming out called Sleeping with the Ancestors. It comes out first week in June.
Mm-hmm.
June 6th. So keep your ears and eyes open for that.
Most certainly.
Yeah.
Well, comrade, with that, I'm always amazed at your ability to recite this history with such ease, and you just tell this timeline and you stitch it all together. And you know the story of Stephen Schwales,
yes,
who was the mayor of Williamsburg, Kingstree rather,
Kingstree
County. He was the editor of the Williamsburg Republican.
Correct.
And he fought with the Massachusetts 54th during the Civil War.
Right. That book is sold here too.
Yeah, and he became a state senator.
Right.
His portrait is now in the state chamber. We know that story, but I was wondering, are there any other Stephen Schwales in South Carolina's history?
I can go on along with that.
Who fought for the Union?
Well,
black soldiers, that is.
Okay. Well, as a matter of fact, the 54th taught black children in the community I grew up in Mount Pleasant, as a matter of fact, the Massachusetts 54th did. And most of the Reconstruction people who are famous on Robert Smalls was probably the main one who did actual fighting for the Union. But there's a couple things I forgot to mention while we talked on that. Is that my tour guests are always surprised when I tell them about Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, who in 1872 was the black Reconstruction governor down in Louisiana. And they had the first black lieutenant governor down there, Oscar Dunn, who served from 1869 until he died of natural cause in 1871. Here in South Carolina, from 1870 to 1877, we had two black lieutenant governors. Alonzo Jacob Ramsier, who served from 1870 to 1872, and Richard Howard Gleaves, who served from 1872 to 1877. Richard Howard Gleaves served as lieutenant governor under Governor Franklin Jacob Moses, making this the first time anywhere in the history of America, or perhaps the world, where you had a municipality run by a black lieutenant governor and a Jewish governor at the same time. It was South Carolina from 1872 to 1877. That's how progressive this stuff got before the reactionary leaders misled the people and took all of this backward.
But military men,
Right.
like Stephen Schwab,
Mm-hmm.
you know of any of them?
Well, aside from Robert Smalls, I have to, okay, a good source where you can find out about that would be Freedom's Lawmakers by Philip S. Spooner. Is the best book about that. It has a listing of all of the major and minor black office holders during Reconstruction. Okay, and that book is still available in the Charleston County Library. And off the top of my head, other than Robert Smalls, I really hadn't thought about who in the 54th or the 55th served in office.
Oh, the first South Carolina.
Right, I really don't know. I hadn't thought about it, to be honest with you. Yes.
Well, the other, I'm sorry. So, I'm not sure this also exactly what your question is, but in my study of genealogy, I found a relative who actually served as a sailor. And he was in one of the ships that actually sounds like what that ship was doing. In fact, DuPont was the head of the ship. I don't know what the admiral maybe, because I think he was admiral of the Atlantic coast, the whole Atlantic section of it. But so there are soldiers, and as best as I can try and figure out, he probably enlisted. I mean, his family was here in Charleston, but he probably enlisted in Edisto or in that area, because I'm guessing that as blacks were sent, as enslaved people were sent to help with the barricades, I forget. I'm sorry, I don't have the language.
The Fort Wall experiment, maybe?
They had to build up the barricades to protect the land from the bombardments, okay? And so all of the plantation owners had to send enslaved people south to help with that. I am guessing that he was one of those, but because that part of the area where it became free, because of course that's where the Union came aboard in Edisto and all that fairly early in the Civil War, that because he was free, he was able to sign up, and he actually became a sailor. I actually found his name in the logbook of the ship that he was on, and so there, and I found his name actually in this soldier and sailors database. So you can put names in and see who was a soldier and etc. And that's how I found it in there in the book. So I'm not sure that answers your question, but I suspect
that helps.
Those folks who were sent to Beaufort in that whole area to help with the military had an opportunity to join up. And like this, he couldn't have been the only person who did that. Right.
Yes, ma'am.
Going back to your original premise about the fact that the keeping of poor whites separate from newly emancipated blacks was so much of the foundation of the tension that we continue to live through today. You are so good and you've committed all of your writing to lost stories. I'm curious whether you're either curious about, or do you know others that are really diligently trying to collect the lost stories of whites, poor whites, who are resisting as well, who are understanding. I mean, we hear about the Klan and the red shirts, and so I think there is this stereotype that about white people who went that route.
Right.
Who were certainly the majority, perhaps, but I'm curious about what's happening to find the lost stories of white people who understood that they were being used as well.
Well,
Do you know of anything or
Dr. George Hopkins, I don't think he's who most of us in this room know, and who in fact taught me the history of the U.S. labor movement. There's the best known work about that would be the study of the Populist Party of the 1890s.
Right.
Okay, now for those of you who are watching this who don't know what I'm talking about, the Populist Party was also known as the Farmers Alliance, where poor farmers throughout the South tried to organize to make things better for the farmer. Well, you also had what was called the Colored Farmers Alliance, and they worked hand in hand with the White Farmers Alliances in those days, and you had amazing spectacles such as black and white farmers banding together to stop people from foreclosing on farms and things of that sort, right? And Martin Luther King, in fact, talks about this in a section of his speech, not the dream speech, but in the speech that he made at Selma, Alabama, March 25th, 1965, when they went from Selma to the State House in Montgomery, Alabama. He talks about how in the days of the Populist Party, the white aristocrats feared the populists for bringing the poor whites and blacks together in order to make a better deal for the farmers. So what they did was to break up the populists taking votes away from the Democratic Party. They appealed to the insecurity of the poor whites and said, wait a minute now, if you're with these black fellas, guess what? They'll be on top and you'll be on the bottom. Do you want that? And of course they didn't. And so that stole a lot of the support of the populists into the Democratic Party of that time because, in other words, the fact they figured that the fact that instead of these people working together, they would appeal to their insecurity as poor people and make it so that they would no longer be on the bottom of the totem pole. Well, that proved to be a somewhat more appealing philosophy for a lot of people because you see, I always say that maturity is when you understand the difference between theory and reality with a lot of people. So it's important that people understand that they're being fooled with that. Now, another person who, hello, Mayor, good to see you. Come on in.
One of my favorite authors, y'all.
Thank you. So anyway, one of the other people, aside from Martin Luther King, in that speech on March 25th, 1965, who articulated all that so well, and you could look this up on YouTube, is Bob Dylan in his song Only a Pawn in Their Game. When Bob Dylan wrote about how Byron de la Beckwith, the man who killed Medgar Evers, about how basically the people who were on the top of the Mississippi government and states like that used poor, illiterate white men to fight against the blacks so that the poor would stay fighting each other and the wealthy people like Ross Barnett, the governor of Mississippi, would always stay on top.
Well, the same dynamic played out in colonial America and colonial Virginia at Bacon's Castle, where indentured whites were aligning themselves with enslaved blacks, but the colonial government rewrote the codes to keep them apart.
Let me say this about that, okay? This idea that Nathaniel Bacon was this great, was this prophet of racial harmony, quite frankly, that's a bunch of bunk. And let me explain why I said that. If you read the primary sources about the Bacon's Rebellion, the real reason why Nathaniel Bacon wanted to rebel was because he felt that the Virginia government was too lenient on Native Americans, and he wanted their land. Okay, if you read the actual primary sources of that, you got to remember, historians do not always write without prejudice. That whole interpretation, this myth about him being this great uniter of blacks and whites, that came from Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. And Howard Zinn is very much of a Marxist historian, and that kind of interpretation sort of fits his ideology more than if you actually read the real primary source. In the same way that if you look at the background of a lot of famous people who were thought to be great and see what they really said about some things, it makes you say, wait a minute. So that stuff about Bacon's rebellion on that level was a myth. What is true is this. That main thing got started with the story of John Punch. Are you familiar with the story of John Punch? Okay, well, let me explain. John Punch was a black man who ran away with some white indentured servants. And at this time in colonial Virginia, you had that situation where the white indentured servants and the enslaved blacks were getting along quite swimmingly, right? So, of course, they wanted to break that up. So what happened was that when John Punch ran away with these two white guys, they gave the white guys a couple of years, and they gave John Punch lifetime in slavery as a punishment. And so that began the slow process of making that eternal distinction between black and white among the poor, that divide and conquer so that the rich can stay on top.
I am going to interrupt to say that we want you to continue the conversation and stay, but I know that some people have to leave.
Mm-hmm.
Damon, this has been fascinating, and I will say that so many similarities in what we're living through today. And Damon's book absolutely highlights that. If you have not read it, I suggest that you do. Give it as a gift. I think we could continue the conversation. We need to continue the conversation. Thank you for helping us to question history that we have been learned and question a lot of the beliefs that we don't realize have been built into the fabric of the way we think. And so thank you for helping us question and to learn more stories. Keep researching. Keep writing
You're glad we
stories.
helped. You're glad we helped.
Thank you.